Hello, History 72A Winter Quarter 2024. We are nearing the end of the quarter, and I'd like to invite any of you who feel like have something you want to say about your project, even if you feel like you haven't quite finished it, to present in the last week of classes. I can either play a video or audio that you've produced, or if you're not to that point yet, you could just give a brief talk about what you've discovered and found interesting. This particular lecture is one of those setting the stage for the rest of the module lecture, so it's fairly short. A quick warning before I start here. I may have warned you before that I love examining words for meaning, particularly changes in meaning in my lectures. But be careful about doing that in formal papers, especially for other history classes. It is frowned upon in formal papers by many historians to start off with the definition of X is whatever. The titles of this module and lecture take advantage of the meanings, plural, of revolution. Something that is revolutionary results in change, but the nature of that change for different people often varies. Just as we, as historians, want to be clear about for whom something has been a tradition and for how long, we also want to be clear about the effects of change on different groups. And we definitely do not want to assume that changes and progress are synonymous for those affected by revolutionary shifts. At its most basic, the word revolution suggests some type of change. If we are talking about the solar system, a revolution is a trip around the sun. If we are talking about physics or time, a revolution could be turning around or going around. For example, object X completed 6.5 revolutions in a minute. In disciplines like art, something revolutionary changes some part of the field, and the scale of that change is great enough to make the direction or character of the field change. Historians have revolutions that are not necessarily first and foremost bloody battles over government. Industrial revolution, scientific revolution, market revolution. Here, revolutions are times of more rapid change and something that is tied into multiple shifts in society and thought overall. These are not periods with set dates, at least not ones that everyone agrees on. For example, do we begin the scientific revolution with Galileo? Galileo modeled his telescope on the so-called Danish perspective glass. Should we start there? These ages of revolution represent processes of change. Where we choose to start and end them as historians depends on the story we are telling and the questions that we are asking. You may notice, depending on the dates chosen, that these three revolutions on the slide, scientific revolution, industrial revolution, and market revolution, overlap. The so-called scientific revolution started first, the industrial revolution took shape a bit after, and the market revolution began a bit after the industrial revolution. We can think of the history in a way that relates these strands to one another. Particular approaches to examining the world began to accumulate. Certain types of technology emerged from new understandings of the world. Industrial products like steam engines and textile mills opened up possibilities for making and moving stuff in greater volumes than previously possible. Politics and history also have revolutions that involve a change in government, usually, but not always, with violence. Notably, the Glorious Revolution of England was completely bloodless, no battles at all. Revolutions in other regions around the North Atlantic had considerable bloodshed. The American Revolution, starting in 1775, the French Revolution in 1789, the Haitian Revolution in 1791, and then a series of revolutions in Latin America beginning in 1807-ish. If you're keeping track of dates, you may have noticed that these revolutions track into the overlapping periods of the previous historical revolutions, particularly the industrial and market revolutions. Here is a timeline. I made it a bit wonky, but hopefully it will still help to fit things together in your head. I've shown the scientific, industrial, and market revolutions with thicker lines for the bits most people agree on in terms of dates, and thinner lines for the times that people discuss more. I could have done the same thing on the periods above the line. I decided that there was more than enough going on already. These periods above, the Enlightenment corresponds to the long 18th century, which means it's the 18th century plus a little at the beginning and at the end. The Age of Reason is generally 1715 to 1789 and is basically corresponds with the Enlightenment with a little bit of difference in emphasis. The Age of Revolutions starts with the late 18th century, the late 1700s, and goes into the early 19th century, the 1800s at least. You can see how many of these overlap in the 18th century. And many Europeans at the time felt like they were experiencing an era of unprecedented transformation, or at the very least, many major changes were occurring around them quickly. I'm giving you all of this for Western thought in the Atlantic region because the American Revolution did not come out of nowhere. It emerged out of many strands of changing thought that themselves rested on strands from the early modern period, including thoughts shaped by colonialism. Even the seemingly most abrupt of events is a tipping point because it occurs in an era of increasing probability, not because it was inevitable, not because it was somehow better than what came before. Strands that continue to develop slowly or that fade without triggering a tipping point don't show up on the timeline. Timelines, like anatomical drawings, are tailored to tell a certain story. This, on the slide, is history. The black squiggle that I've drawn follows developments of the plum-colored bits, but the plum series of events, whatever they happen to be, is not the only thing happening in this historical window, nor does the plum color happen without effects from everything else going on. The pale blue does not form a neat line that we can trace easily, but that does not make the light blue irrelevant. You can see the light blue most clearly where the darker shades are more sparse, but it is still there under the events in the middle. You can catch little glimpses of it. In fact, it looks like it is just after an encounter with light blue that plum begins to disappear. This is obviously one of my silly analogies, but I want you to remember that the storylines I am giving you in this class are in no way the whole picture. This particular timeline on this slide was made by English speakers, and you can tell that by the events considered relevant enough to include. I would imagine that you cannot read the text, even if your eyesight is a good deal better than mine. So I will point out some interesting bits. 1609 is the start, because that is supposedly the year in which Galileo invented the telescope. But we know that he actually developed the telescope from earlier Danish research and technology. The timeline ends in 1827, the year given for the invention of the striking match. You may or may not have considered the striking match an incredible tipping point in history, but for the people who made this timeline, it clearly was. The brick-colored arrow points to the American Revolution. The book above the arrow is Voltaire's Candide. The arrow is not meant to link Candide and the American Revolution beyond both being part of the larger story of the Enlightenment shown on the timeline. Moving in a bit closer here, there is the American Revolution at the arrow tip. The red oval is around the Declaration of Independence, and the dark purple oval is around the ratification of the American Constitution. Notice now, this is something that confuses a lot of people. There is a space of years between those two documents. The Constitution was not in effect when the United States was first formed. I have not circled it, but 1792 is the invention of the cotton gin, which is relevant to the course that racialized chattel slavery followed in the new United States. The fuchsia oval above the line is around the earliest bicycles developed in Scotland. The green circle is around the invention of the bifocal lens for vision correction. You have to dig a bit deeper to find the themes linking bicycles, spectacles, and the founding documents of the US. But that does not mean that there's no relationship at all between them, just not one that we generally think is important enough to trace. The blue arrow here is around Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis Wheatley is featured on the tab for this course site in the middle there. Wheatley is recognized as the first African-American poet to be published. We could add that she was one of, if not the first, poets in the newly formed United States to be published, full stop. Wheatley was brought from Africa as an enslaved person in 1761. Her first name, Phyllis, was the name of the slave ship that transported her over the Atlantic. Her last name, Wheatley, comes from the family who bought her. Her relationship to the Wheatleys is one of those frustrating stories in history that seem inexplicable now, but make some sense in a full historical context. So let's look at that. George Washington and Benjamin Franklin were personally introduced to Phyllis Wheatley. Washington spoke glowingly of her poetry, as did John Hancock and Benjamin Rush, both signers of the Declaration of Independence. Despite this, no one in North America would publish her work, although a London publisher did. Phyllis Wheatley was one of, if not the first authors to use Columbia to represent the United States. Although Columbia would be widely used throughout the 19th century after her death, it was not attributed to her nor to her poem. Britannia owns her independent reign. Britannia stands for Great Britain. Hibernia, Scotia, and the realms of Spain and Great Germania's ample coast admires the generous spirit that Columbia fires. Columbia stands for the United States. Auspicious heaven shall fill with favoring gales where'er Columbia spreads her swelling sails. To every realm shall peace her charms display, and heavenly freedom spread her golden ray. But how presumptuous shall we hope to find divine acceptance with the Almighty mind, while yet, O deed ungenerous, they disgrace, and hold in bondage Afric, blameless race. Let virtue reign, and then accord our prayers, be victory ours, and generous freedom theirs. This is part of one of the poems that Wheatley had written and no one in the American colonies would publish before her death. The Wheatleys kept Phyllis enslaved until 3 months before the death of Mrs. Wheatley. The Wheatleys taught Phyllis to read and to write. They took her to London. They introduced her work to publishers. But that entire time, they kept her enslaved. The Wheatley family disintegrated through early deaths after the death of Mrs. Wheatley. Phyllis Wheatley married a free Black man who hoped to be one of America's early entrepreneurs. He was unsuccessful, largely because he was never really allowed to act in businesses and economy run by white British colonial men. Phyllis wrote a second book of poetry, but again, no one in the new United States now would publish it until after her death. She could not afford on her own without the Wheatleys to send it to London, and despite asking, she could not find anyone to sponsor her. Not Washington, not Franklin, not Hancock or Rush. Phyllis Wheatley died in excruciating poverty as Phyllis Wheatley Peters, and she died alone. By the early 20th century, the scholars who had only a partial knowledge of her work criticized her for what they thought was a lack of concern with slavery. She was active with 18th century abolitionists, Black abolitionists, but white historians for much of the 20th century focused principally on white abolitionists. With that, I am circling back to the subtitle of this module, Module E, Revolutions, revolutionary for some, not so much for others. And this covers the late 18th, early 19th centuries. The American Revolution is hailed as marking a significant tipping point in world history. At our point in time now, the formation of the US is in fact history, but it was not at all clear in the 18th century how events would play out. In the aftermath of the revolution, white, well-to-do men representing the United States put together a constitution they could agree on, as well as developing a system of federal and state, formerly colonies, government. The changes that they made to customary British law were revolutionary for some things and for some people, but they made no meaningful change in the lives of others. One of the challenges to forming a unified country from the 13 colonies was slavery. And in order to unify the white populations and power structures of the 13 colonies, slavery was protected by the United States Constitution, although never identified by name. In the US Constitution, enslaved people are referred to as other persons, and, quote, such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit, and, quote, person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof. And note from this image that we are not talking about just a few persons, conceivably out of sight and out of mind, to the white men arguing over how to write a constitution for their new enlightened country. Your readings for this module include pieces in the language of Enlightenment ideals, of freedom and personal liberty, invoked by the men who played large parts in both the American Revolution and the writing and ratification of the United States Constitution for the new republic. These are your readings for this module. We have seen that liberty and freedom had different meanings in the early modern period for the English than the words have now. This was true in the late 18th century as well. But it also was not as if the founding fathers were unaware of systemic inequality. And they were aware to a large extent because people like Phyllis Wheatley and Benjamin Banneker, who experienced systemic inequality, told the founding fathers repeatedly that they were hypocrites, meaning people pointed out that the founding fathers invoked natural rights for themselves while denying those same rights to others. You will hear in some places that certain of the founding fathers criticized slavery. And this is true, sort of, and sometimes. But basically, clicking the sad emoji 18th century style rather than persevering in a moral commitment is unsatisfactory, particularly if you claim natural human rights for yourself. A few quotes on the slide here. We have seen the mere distinction of color made in the most enlightened period of time a ground of the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man. That was James Madison in Notes on the Federal Convention, 1787. Following that, we have the whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part, and degrading submissions on the other. That was Thomas Jefferson, Notes on the State of Virginia, 1785. Thomas Jefferson held a number of enslaved people and had a family with an enslaved woman. That family he left enslaved. Another quote, religion and humanity had nothing to do with this question of slavery. Interest alone is the governing principle with nations. John Rutledge from South Carolina, Notes on the Federal Convention, 1787. I understand the context in which that group of men who wrote the U.S. Constitution made decisions and what they thought they were setting the stage for. But as with the early modern laws creating slavery, these men knowingly made a choice. Those writers of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, who could see the immorality of slavery even by their own standards, they decided in the U.S. Constitution to just kick the can down down the road, rather than make substantive changes in a system that harmed people that they personally knew. I know that you probably cannot read these clauses on the slide, but they are easy to find if you know where to look up transcriptions of the U.S. Constitution. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 of our Constitution, if you're American, says, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, that would be indentured servants, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. Those other persons would be the enslaved. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1. The migration makes it sound like people want to migrate, or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation, not exceeding $10 for each person. And that's where we get to those people are being imported, they are enslaved. And what this means is that the Constitution prohibited making the transatlantic slave trade illegal until 1808. Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, so we're clearly not talking about a freely entered into contract there, escaping into another shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim to the party to whom such service or labor may be due. In other words, if you are an enslaved person and you would escape, the law of the U.S. in the Constitution said that you needed to be collected and returned to the person who claimed you. When it came to women, the founders basically laughed off suggestions that women should be accorded rights given to men, even women of the founders' own class, even members of their family. If you read the correspondence between Abigail and John Adams, you will see that the exclusion of women was based on a series of prepared reasons. Whether all of the men, like Adams, actually believed those reasons, they pulled them out when they felt threatened, even to women they loved and respected. The word concept packages of freedom, liberty, people were products of Enlightenment thought. The excuses the Founding Fathers appealed to make themselves feel okay about denying those ideals of freedom, liberty, and people to a majority of people in the new United States were also products of the Enlightenment. In case you do not know, this is the preamble to the U.S. Constitution, We the People. The meme is from the movie Princess Bride, which, like Monty Python and the Holy Grail, has oversights and issues, but also has some incredibly quotable lines. In this case, you keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. The next lecture in this module will examine the ideas of inequality built into Enlightenment philosophy that gave the Founding Fathers, as well as many other white European non-working class men, the language and authority to deny other people the rights that they were so keen to claim for themselves, including being willing to force members of the lower classes to be soldiers or sailors so that they could fight for those rights for the Founding Fathers. The 18th century also laid the foundations for the public sphere-private sphere division that continues to haunt understandings and misunderstandings of sex gender to this day. We will look at how the initial distinction between public and private was completely tied into race and class, not just gender. Key points for Lecture 17. Europeans and Euro-Americans experienced the 18th century as a time of massive rapid change. Enlightenment, Age of Reason, Industrial Revolution, Market Revolution, Age of Revolutions. The American Revolution and subsequent U.S. Constitution only conferred the natural rights of the Enlightenment philosophy to a small subgroup of people who found themselves in the new United States. The men who led the American Revolution and wrote the US Constitution knew that they were denying equal rights to large groups of people. They chose to do it anyway. People in groups excluded from rights, Black people, women, Native Americans, did not sit idly by and watch this happen. They demanded more equal treatment before, during, and after the Revolution, often using the language of the Enlightenment. Well-to-do white men used the language of Enlightenment philosophy both to demand rights for themselves and to excuse their denial of rights to others. What I am trying to show here is that the actual struggle to disengage the British colonies of North America from the metropole or the mother country rested on the backs of people whom the so-called founding fathers chose not to see as worthy of natural freedom. The men that I had covered up were colonizers. They were not the colonized seeking freedom. They were not the enslaved seeking freedom. We see Benjamin Franklin here and George Washington. They were privileged men who were perfectly willing to curtail the freedoms of others. Covering up the standard founding fathers, starting at the top left, we have the homespun movement, a spy for the Continental Army, a soldier who fought for the Continental Army, a sailor who fought for the Continental Army. These are real people, by the way, they're portraits of real people. This is someone who was identified female at birth and who fought for the Continental Army. These are the Oneida, a group of Native Americans who fought for the Continental Army and still had their land taken after the Revolution by the United States. And this is a spy for the Continental Army. If you haven't gotten it, none of these are cis white men. This is the coda, so I can indulge my own interests in the body and how it is presented to convey meaning. The homespun movement was intended to show that the colonies could get along just fine without the imported luxuries, especially fabrics, that came from England. The idea was that colonial women could produce their own cloth, and wearing clothing made of homespun was a statement to snub the English, a statement embraced by folks like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, who did none of the spinning, weaving, or sewing themselves. And this is an actual homespun coat from the time period. The idea of politicians in sober, thoughtful clothing, as opposed to snazzy outfits like Europeans wore, became part of the American ethos of cultivated but not foppish masculinity that would stick around. The image on the left is a rather resplendent young George Washington done in 1772, so before all of that revolting stuff. The image on the right is called the Lansdowne portrait and painted in 1796 shows Washington embodying the idea of the sober statesman just a few years before the 19th century.